This channel is supported by Truefire. Truefire is an online library of lessons from some of my favourite players. There's thousands of lessons on there. You can use the promo code JNC40 to get 40% off of any of their courses. There's been an update to the Quad Cortex Nano Cortex. I thought it'd be maybe worth talking about again, because for me the HX Stomp was like the best value thing in my opinion, pound for pound, and I have to say one of my favourite devices like ever. But the Nano Cortex with this update, I thought this is actually kind of a little bit more interesting at this point. So I kind of just wanted to put together a video talking about that. I did a capture of the Morgan AC20 like famous profile from the Kemper onto here. So that's what I'm using for the Nano Cortex, and then I'm using GlassyPlexi2024 for the HX Stomp. Jump into the folder if you want to try that. Jump into the cloud if you want to try that. Pedalboard friendliness and how these integrate into your pedalboard. Now, the main downside with the HX Stomp for me is the actual powering it up thing. Now, there are a lot of power supplies now will have a high, like 3 amp-ish power type thing, as well as, you know, like Harley Benton include a lead for it, but it's a different kind of lead format and it's a higher output required than most things, whereas this is just a 9 to 12 volt DC, 600 milliamps it says it needs, you can power this with basically most power supplies. So in terms of pedalboard friendliness, I think the Nano Cortex kind of wins from the power element, as well as being slightly smaller. Now, what I think it would be fair to say, this is far more sort of expandable in terms of MIDI capabilities. So it's got MIDI in and MIDI out. This has just got like a little bit of a nod to MIDI. At the moment, I guess this could change, maybe. But what you can do with MIDI is basically select presets out of like the 127 or whatever it is, presets that you can save on the Nano Cortex. So there's no sort of big MIDI plan with the Nano Cortex that we're aware of. Whereas the HX Stomp, of course, with MIDI you can get in there, you can change presets, you can change elements of effects within any preset. So if you are someone who's looking to integrate the HX Stomp into a pedalboard in that kind of way, then this is probably your way to go, as well as having ascend and return, as well as having parallel paths. So for instance, what I do on my live board is I've got the HX Stomp running a amp simulation that goes to front of house, but I split off before that amp sim, so the drives and stuff and delays go before the amp sim, and then I split off from the send into my amp that I've got on stage. So in terms of versatility like that, I think the HX Stomp takes the win. So power supply and size, the Nano Cortex takes the win. Having MIDI implementation and sort of routing options, this one wins. Now, the next kind of thing that I think is a little bit more difficult to compare is workflow to some extent, where obviously the HX Stomp has modeling, this only really has capture. So you need to think about this a little bit. So one of the struggles with the HX Stomp is that your starting point is going to be from modeling. So say for instance you had an amp that was a bit weird maybe, or you know, not even in here. I think there's like 90 odd amps in here or something like that. If your amp isn't in here, then you have to go through this kind of routine of trying to find something close. But not only that, sometimes you might even find that, you know, the amp that they've modeled in there doesn't necessarily remind you that much of your real amp. I think that's definitely an experience that a lot of people have had over the years. And part of that might be user error, part of that might be because the amps themselves are actually different, you know, if like they're two disparate examples. And then another part could just be that, you know, modeling in general doesn't sound the same as an amp in the room. So there's all of that going on. Versus with the neural stuff, the captures are not necessarily 100% accurate or anything like that, but they'll get you close enough that I think that you're not going to be worried about that so much anymore. So say you had a Morgan AC20, or you had a profile of a Morgan AC20 that you really liked in a Kemper. With the HX Stomp, I kind of have to sort of use my ear and build off of that. And I ended up using like a Plexi, just modified that slightly. Versus the Nano Cortex, I could just plug it in and capture it, and most of the time the results are pretty good. Like even, you know, capturing a Two Rock TS1, I've done that in the past. It's generally pretty good, you know, on par, maybe slightly even better than Kemper. I think Tonex is maybe the other real key competitor here, and of course NAMM. What this has an advantage of is that it's able to do it in the unit itself. So it's kind of a little bit of a which do you prefer, but if you're someone who's not necessarily already got a modeler or hasn't got on with these modeling things in the past, then I think the Nano Cortex could be a bit of a different thing, because it, you know, under £450 at the moment, you know, you plug that in front of your deluxe reverb and it'll basically sound like the deluxe reverb sounds like recorded, right? Whereas if you go in and build your preset, it's going to take probably more than 5 minutes, I'd guess, on the HX Stomp. And will your end result necessarily be as close as the Nano Cortex? Probably, I would guess not without a lot of time. So that for me is kind of how it goes. The community captures part of it is a little bit of the Wild West, and you never really know what you're going to get. That's the one downside with the Nano Cortex. For me, what I would like to see is that you were able to access Neural DSP's capture library. That's kind of one of my things that I think would really improve things for the Nano Cortex, because at the moment it's all kind of community led. There's not really, like Tonex have their own sort of, they're capturing dumbles and stuff. Neural DSP have done all of their own sort of factory captures, like thousands of them for Quad Cortex, but there's only 25 included here. The next thing I wanted to talk about was maybe effects, and I would say, of course, the HX Stomp has a fairly big advantage here. With that said, I think maybe the advantage with the Nano Cortex is the simplified approach here, and the effects do sound pretty good. Now, there are also a couple of effects in here that are not in the HX Stomp. Now, of course, there's way more effects that are in the HX Stomp that are not in the Nano Cortex, but I thought I'd just raise it. The Boss OD1, which is like the precursor to the Tube Screamer, and obviously the Boss SD1. That's quite a nice sort of boosty, edge of breakup type Tube Screamer-ish, but a little bit nicer in my opinion. And also the Boss Blues Driver 2, which I think is great, and I'd really love to see Line 6 actually put one of them in here. In terms of, you know, drive pedals that are classic that are not in here, I think that's definitely one of them. But of course the effects list for the Nano Cortex is far more pared back. Across all of the categories, the HX Stomp really is going to, I think, win here, as well as the ability, as I've said earlier, parallel paths, so you can build some stuff that's a little bit more complex, you know, like building freeze presets, that sort of stuff. I think for effects, the HX Stomp does take the win. Other things you've got going on with the HX Stomp that you can't really do with the Nano Cortex at this point: dual amping, so you could have like dual amps in one preset that are kind of stereo panned. Yes, DSP is a limiting factor there, but you can do that. Like my main jazz preset is a Vox AC30 and or maybe a Princeton, but anyway, 2 amps in that. I've got other presets which are like the Litigator and the Aristocrat, like 2 Dumble style amps in one. The HX Stomp takes the edge there. And then if you were using it with a real amp, I think the HX Stomp is going to be the way to go. The Nano Cortex, I think, is more really meant to have that capture in it all points. If you think of it really as a capture player, you know, that makes more sense. I don't think it would make much sense as like just an effects unit with a real amp. That's not really the form factor, that's not really what it was designed for. They do have this global turn off the IR bypass, so it could be used in like the return of a real amp, but in terms of, you know, if you're the average blues player or function player or whatever like that, I think it's really just designed to be used with an FRFR or straight to front of house with in-ears. Then the one last thing I wanted to talk about was really gigging, because so the HX Stomp is pretty good for gigging. I'll maybe show you some stuff on screen, but the way that I use it is either, if I'm just using the HX Stomp, I have this rhythm, lead and clean, so you've got access to 3 snapshots per preset. Or I have it set up so I've got a delay, and a tap tempo. Now there's not any super easy way to switch that mode on the fly. The advantage that the Nano Cortex surprisingly has here is that it has like a toggle set up. So you have on this switch here toggling between 2 presets, and on this switch here toggling between 2 presets. So you can have basically 4 sounds on the unit itself. If you incorporate Midi, you can do other stuff, and likewise with the HX Stomp, if you incorporate Midi, you can do other stuff. The other thing that you can do with the HX Stomp is you could have these 2 switches doing that same sort of thing as this, if you wanted to. So you can use this thing called stacked snapshots, is what they've essentially been coined as, I think by Steve Stilacci. But each snapshot can have a different command under each foot switch. So you could say, if you're on snapshot 1, this one points to snapshot 2, but if you're on snapshot 2, this points to snapshot 1. You could set things up in that way, but you still only have 3 snapshots, so it doesn't really get you your kind of 4 snapshot situation, which is actually, I think, practically very useful for gigging. I've often found that 3 snapshots isn't quite enough to get through a gig. I've had this other delay that essentially I need for one song, so it's like you need an additional foot switch or the HX Stomp XL, whereas if you had 4 presets like this does, I do think that is reasonably quite a good way to get through a gig if you're using just that. I'm on a gig here as well, and I go, right, I've got too much delay, I can come in here and just make a quick edit like that. For instance, your view here without a screen, if I'm wanting to edit reverb, this final flashing thing here, that's the amount there, right? if I wanted to edit delay, in my eyes, I need my glasses on. So that's mod, that's delay. So now I can edit the delay amount, but it's nowhere near. You need a phone there really to do any of these edits, I think, in any sensible way, except for like the tone stack is, you know, that's fine to edit. I think it's not the most intuitive. This part of it, without a screen, it's not that easy to imagine that this making much sense in the heat of battle. In terms of editing at home, I would say I think like the Nano Cortex phone experience is a pretty good one. I personally would quite like a PC editor for it maybe, but the phone works well, connects really well every time, stays connected, so no complaints from that regard. Whereas the HX Stomp, editing on the unit I've found really useful over time, and the editor on the PC is good too, but you've not got that phone editing capability. I think that is really quite a forward-looking thing, where it's like, well, everyone kind of already has a screen that can interface with these things. In order to keep the power requirements down on these things, why don't we just pair it with a phone? I think it's not a bad idea. So I do think it's actually way closer now than it was. It's more about whether you decide that you want to go down the modeling route or this capture idea, where your starting points for your tones are like a different approach. So I don't know, let me know your thoughts in the comments. The other thing with the HX Stomp that I really like is that it's compatible with Helix Native. So I have this thing where I don't even have to have the hardware. Like every day I come to my computer and I use Helix Native. It's really, really, really useful. And that's how I mostly interface with Helix products these days. I just use Helix Native more than anything else. But on my board, I do have an HX Stomp running, as I said, stuff to front of house and all of that. So those are my thoughts on that. For me, still, I think the HX Stomp takes the #1 spot. But if you're not going to be getting too deep into some of this tweaking, you're thinking, right, I want like a pretty decent experience of like a good range of choice of stuff. I really want this idea that I can capture some of my favorite amps or go through some of the other community stuff, like, you know, people that have captured some of their great amps. I want to try that sort of thing. Then I think the Nano Cortex, particularly if you're not necessarily someone who wants to get into modeling, maybe as your first toe in the waters, you don't want to spend £1,500 on a quad Cortex, then the Nano Cortex might be just the thing, I think. Anyway, let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'll catch you in another video soon. Cheers. Oh, my knees.